The train whistle screamed like a dying man, and in 1887 that was a sound folks in Willow Creek knew all too well. The steam engine hissed, spitting grey clouds into a pewter sky that promised a hard winter. On the platform, shivering in a dress too thin for the cold, stood Clara May Dawson. She was 27 years old, but the chill in her bones felt 100 years deep. At her feet, a single scuffed satchel held everything she owned in the world, but the heaviest thing she carried was the hole in her chest. She'd arrived that morning with a letter, a promise. Words from a man who'd sworn he needed a wife, and she'd traveled 1,000 miles with that paper folded against her heart. She'd stepped off that train with hope, a fragile flame in the bitter wind. Then he saw her. He saw the patched dress, the worn-out boots, the hunger in her eyes that no amount of pride could hide, and he just turned away. No words, no apology. Just the cold, hard slap of a man deciding she wasn't good enough. The whispers started before he'd even cleared the platform. Turned down, left at the station, another desperate woman. The words were like stones, and Clara felt every single one hit. Shame burned her cheeks hotter than any stove. She tried to stand tall, but her shoulders slumped. Her eyes fell to the splintered planks beneath her feet. She just wanted to disappear, to melt away like the snowflakes in the train's steam. She was nothing. She was nobody. And then a small voice cut through the noise. "Are you my mommy?" Clara's head snapped up. Standing before her was a little girl, no older than 3. Her hair was a tumble of sun-gold curls, her cheeks rosy from the cold. Her clothes were patched, just like Clara's, but her eyes, they were the color of a clear mountain sky, and they were looking right into Clara's soul. The little girl tilted her head, a serious look on her face. Then she leaned in a little closer, took a tiny sniff, and whispered with the certainty only a child can have. "I can smell the mommy on you." Clara's knees buckled. She was on the ground before she even knew she was moving, the cold of the wood seeping through her dress. A sob clawed its way up her throat, hot and painful. She had no one, no family, no children, nothing. And here was this tiny stranger, this little angel, seeing something in her that no one else ever had. Her trembling hand reached out, brushing a curl from the girl's forehead, and then she pulled the child into her arms. The little girl fit perfectly, like a missing piece of her own heart. Tears finally broke free, hot tracks on Clara's frozen cheeks. She was holding on to this child like a drowning woman holds onto a piece of driftwood. She didn't know who this little girl was or where she came from. All she knew was that in this one moment, on this cold, cruel train platform, she wasn't alone. But she was being watched. From the shadows of the station house, a man stood motionless. Silas McGrath. A name whispered with a mix of pity and fear in Willow Creek. He was a mountain of a man, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world, and eyes the color of a coming storm. His wife had died 2 winters back, a sickness that took her quick, leaving him with nothing but a broken heart, and their daughter, Ellie Rose. The same Ellie Rose who was now clinging to a complete stranger. He watched them, this broken woman and his lonely child, and something deep inside his chest cracked open. He hadn't felt anything but grief and ice for 2 years. But this was different. He cleared his throat, the sound rough, and his boots crunched on the frosted boards as he stepped forward. Clara looked up, her eyes wide with fear, pulling Ellie Rose even tighter. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to fight for this child she'd only just met. "She ain't usually one to talk to strangers," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. He tipped his hat, a gesture of respect he hadn't offered anyone in a long, long time. Clara just stared, unable to speak, brushing at her tears with the back of a worn glove. Silas bent down and gently lifted Ellie Rose into his arms. The little girl whined, reaching back for Clara, her tiny fingers grasping at the air. Silas looked back at Clara, at her thin coat and her empty hands. His next words weren't a question. They were a fact. "You've no place to go." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat and shook her head. No. The single word was a surrender. Silas's jaw clenched. The last thing he needed was another soul to care for. His own life was a barely managed disaster, but the image of this woman, kneeling on the cold ground, weeping as she held his daughter, It wouldn't let him go. An old, forgotten part of him, a part that still remembered warmth and kindness, spoke up against his better judgment. "My cabin's not much," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue, "but it's warmer than this station. You can stay for a spell." Pride and desperation fought a war in Clara's eyes. Her first instinct was to say no, to wrap her shame around her like a blanket and walk out into the snow. But then Ellie rose from the safety of her father's arms, reached for her again. And just like that, Clara's resolve shattered. She nodded. The walk was silent, the only sound the crunch of their boots in the fresh snow. Silas carried his sleeping daughter, and Clara followed, clutching her satchel to her chest like a shield. The cabin was small, a dark shape against the endless white of the prairie, with a single window glowing with faint yellow light. Wood smoke hung in the air, a scent of home that made Clara's heart ache. When Silas pushed the door open, she saw a simple room. A table, a few rough chairs, a stove that radiated a gentle warmth, and a narrow cot by the hearth. It wasn't much, but it was the safest place she'd been in her entire life. Silas laid Ellie Rose on his own bed, pulling a thick wool blanket over her. Clara, unable to stand still, went to the stove. She found a pot of soup simmering and ladled some into a bowl. Her hands shook as she brought it to the little cot, where Ellie Rose was starting to stir. She fed the child spoonful by spoonful, humming a tune she didn't realize she knew. The little girl leaned against her, her small hand curling around Clara's sleeve, and fell back asleep. From the doorway, Silas watched. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, a silent guardian in his own home. He watched this stranger care for his daughter with a tenderness he hadn't seen since his wife, since Sarah. Guilt twisted in his gut. Guilt for the way the firelight caught the red in Clara's hair. Guilt for the way her soft humming filled the empty corners of the cabin, chasing away the ghosts. He felt like a traitor, but he couldn't look away. Days turned into a week. Clara fell into a quiet routine. She swept the floors, mended Silas's shirts, braided Ellie Rose's tangled hair. She moved through the small cabin like a ghost, never asking for anything, never taking up more space than she had to. But her presence was changing things. It was in the smell of baking bread that now filled the air, in the clean-swept hearth, in the sound of laughter that sometimes escaped Ellie Rose's lips. The town, however, was not so welcoming. The whispers followed her like a shadow. "That's the woman who was turned away. Now she's shacked up with the widower." The women at the mercantile would stop talking when she entered, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and scorn. Clara felt their judgment like a physical weight, pressing down on her, trying to crush her. But every time she felt like breaking, Ellie Rose would slip a small, warm hand into hers, and Clara would find the strength to lift her chin just a little bit higher. Silas saw it all. He saw the way the town looked at her, and he saw the way she pretended not to notice. He started leaving small things for her, a pair of his late wife's thicker gloves by the door, a piece of dried apple left on the table. He never said a word. He didn't know how. The silence between them was a chasm filled with unspoken grief and a fragile, terrifying hope. He lay awake at night, listening to her breathing from the cot by the fire, and wondered if he was bringing this woman into his storm, or if she was the calm after it. One evening, snow was falling in thick, silent curtains outside the window. Clara sat by the fire, with Ellie Rose asleep in her lap. The child stirred, her eyelids fluttering. She looked up at Clara, her blue eyes drowsy and full of trust. "Are you my mommy?" she whispered again, the question soft as a prayer. Clara's throat went tight. She brushed the hair from the girl's forehead, her fingers trembling. This time she didn't hesitate. "Maybe I am, little one," she whispered back, her voice thick with tears. She didn't know that Silas was standing in the shadows of the doorway. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words hit him like a physical blow. His heart twisted in a way that was both painful and sweet. It was dangerous what was happening. It was impossible. But as he watched Clara kiss his daughter's head, he knew deep in his gut that something had already changed forever. He turned and slipped back outside into the cold, his jaw clenched against the storm of feelings inside him. The silence in the cabin wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy. It was filled with the terrifying weight of what was to come. A few days later, while cleaning the small shelf above Silas's bed, Clara's fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound book. It was tucked away, almost hidden. A diary. Her first instinct was to put it back, to respect the man's privacy. But her curiosity was a living thing, a whisper in her ear. Her hand trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. It wasn't Silas's journal, it was Sarah's. She only meant to read a single page, but the words grabbed her and pulled her in. Sarah wrote of her love for Silas, of her joy in their little daughter. But as Clara read on, a darker story began to unfold, a story of loneliness on the vast prairie, of a deep sadness that she couldn't shake. And then a name appeared that made Clara's blood run cold: Mr. Finch, the man from the train station, the man who had rejected her. Sarah wrote about him constantly. Mr. Finch called again today. He says Silas is a fool, that he doesn't deserve this land. He looks at me in a way that chills my soul. The entries grew more frantic. He offered to buy the debt on our property. He said he could take care of me, that I deserved better than a dirt-poor rancher. I told him to leave, but he just smiled. That terrible, knowing smile. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't just a simple story of a man who didn't want a plain-faced bride. Mr. Finch was woven into the very fabric of this family's pain. He wasn't just a cruel stranger, he was a predator. And he was still here, in Willow Creek, holding power over the entire town. Suddenly, things started to make a horrifying kind of sense. The way the townspeople looked at her with pity. The way Silas was so closed off, so protective. He wasn't just grieving a wife lost to sickness. He was fighting a war against a man who had tried to destroy his life. And now Clara, the woman Finch had publicly shamed, was living under Silas's roof. She wasn't just a guest. She was a liability, a walking, breathing reminder of his enemy's cruelty. That night, the air in the cabin was different. Clara couldn't look at Silas without seeing the battle he was fighting alone. Every time he looked at her, she wondered if he was seeing her, or if he was seeing a ghost, a problem, a danger he'd foolishly invited in. She had to leave, for his sake and for Ellie Rose's. She couldn't be the reason Mr. Finch decided to finally crush this family for good. She waited until she was sure he and Ellie Rose were sound asleep. The moon was a silver sliver in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. She quietly packed her small satchel, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fasten the clasp. She took one last look at the sleeping child, her little face so peaceful, and a tear slipped down her cheek, splashing onto the rough wooden floor. She scribbled a hasty note, just a few words. "Thank you. I'm sorry." She left it on the table and slipped out the door, into the biting cold of the night. The wind howled, whipping her thin dress around her legs. Every step was agony, leaving the only warmth she'd known in years. But she had to do it. She was halfway to the main road when she heard it. A sound that stopped her dead in her tracks, the crunch of boots on snow, coming up fast behind her. It wasn't Silas. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A large figure emerged from the darkness, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. But she recognized the expensive wool coat. She recognized the cruel set of his jaw. It was Mr. Finch. "Leaving so soon?" he sneered, his voice smooth and cold as ice. "I was just coming to pay your host a visit. I have some business with Mr. McGrath. Business that now involves you." He took a step closer, and Clara could smell the whiskey on his breath. You see, a woman who has lived under a man's roof without the benefit of marriage, well, the town has certain opinions about that. And I, as the owner of the bank, have to uphold a certain moral standard. His meaning was clear. He was going to use her to ruin Silas, to call in his debt, to paint him as an immoral man, to take everything he had left. Everything she had tried to prevent by leaving was about to happen anyway. Only now she was alone, in the dark, with the monster from Sarah's diary. "Stay away from him," Clara whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. Finch laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Oh, I don't think so. You've given me the perfect weapon. And I always get what I want." He reached for her, his gloved fingers closing around her arm like a vice. But just as she opened her mouth to scream, another sound cut through the night. the unmistakable metallic click of a rifle being cocked. "Take your hand off her." Silas stepped out from behind a snow-covered pine, his face a mask of cold fury. In his hands, he held a long rifle, and it was aimed directly at Mr. Finch's heart. The prairie was dead silent. The only sounds were the whistling wind and the ragged breathing of three people locked in a standoff that could change everything. Mr. Finch slowly let go of Clara's arm, his eyes narrowing with hate. He hadn't counted on this. He hadn't counted on the quiet, broken rancher having a spine of steel. "McGrath," Finch spat, trying to regain his composure, "this is between me and this woman. It has nothing to do with you." "She's under my roof," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "That makes it my business. You'll leave her be, and you'll stay off my land." Finch let out a short, sharp laugh. "Your land? You mean my land, McGrath. The bank holds the note on this entire section. A note that's coming due. I could have you and your brat out of here by sunrise." Clara's blood ran cold. This was it. The threat from the diary, made real. She looked at Silas, expecting to see defeat in his eyes. Instead, she saw a fire she'd never seen before, a dangerous, protective rage. "You try it," Silas whispered. "You just try it." For a long moment, no one moved. Finch stared down the barrel of the rifle, his arrogance warring with his instinct for self-preservation. Finally, with a curse, he took a step back. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You've made a powerful enemy tonight, McGrath. You'll regret protecting this piece of trash." He turned and stalked back towards the town, his figure swallowed by the darkness. The second he was gone, the strength seemed to drain out of Silas. He lowered the rifle, and the silence that rushed in was deafening. Clara stood frozen, wrapping her arms around herself, shaking uncontrollably from both the cold and the fear. Silas walked over to her, his face grim in the moonlight. "You were leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. He had seen the satchel in her hand, the tracks leading away from his home. Clara couldn't meet his eyes. I read her diary," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "Sarah's. I know about Finch. I thought if I left, he would leave you alone." A muscle tightened in Silas's jaw. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared out at the dark prairie, at the land he was about to lose. Clara braced herself for his anger, for him to tell her to go, to get out of his life and take her trouble with her. Instead, he did something that shocked her to her core. He reached out and gently took the satchel from her hand. "He would have come for me anyway," Silas said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "He's been waiting for an excuse. You didn't cause this, Clara. You just showed up in the middle of it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and his storm-cloud eyes were filled with a weary sorrow. "Come on, let's go home." Home. The word hung in the frozen air between them. He didn't send her away, he called his cabin her home. As they walked back, the snow crunching under their boots, Clara felt a tiny, fragile seed of hope take root in the desolate landscape of her heart. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it had probably just begun. But for the first time, she wasn't fighting it alone. And neither was he. Back in the warmth of the cabin, the tension didn't disappear. It coiled in the air, thick and heavy. Silas added a log to the fire, the crackle and pop of the flames the only sound. Clara made coffee, her hands still trembling as she moved about the small space. They sat at the rough wooden table, on opposite sides, the coffee mug steaming between them like a barricade. "Tell me about her," Clara said softly, breaking the silence. "Tell me about Sarah." Silas stared into his cup, his big hands wrapped around it. He hadn't spoken his wife's name to another soul since the day he buried her. But looking at Clara, at the woman who had faced down his demon in the snow, he found the words. He spoke of how they met, of her laughter that could charm the birds from the trees, of her fierce love for Ellie Rose. But then his voice grew heavy. He spoke of the shadow that fell over her in the last year of her life, the fear, the constant gnawing anxiety. "It was Finch," Silas said, his voice raw. "He wanted her. Before we were married, he courted her. Her family approved. He had money, power, but she chose me. He never forgave either of us for that." He looked up, his eyes meeting Clara's. "He started buying up the debt on all the small ranches around here. Mine was the first. He'd show up, offering to help. But it was always with a price Sarah wasn't willing to pay. He poisoned this place for her. He made her feel trapped. Clara's heart ached for the woman she'd never known and for the man sitting across from her who had been carrying this burden alone. The diary said she was afraid, Clara whispered. It said her death. It wasn't a sickness, Silas interrupted, his voice breaking. He finally said the words out loud. The doctor called it a lung fever, but it was a broken heart. He wore her down, Clara. He made her give up. I found her collapsed by the creek. She was cold, so cold. She was just gone. Tears streamed down Clara's face, silent tears for Sarah, for Silas, for the little girl sleeping peacefully in the next room, oblivious to the ghosts that haunted her home. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His skin was rough, calloused, but he didn't pull away. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. It wasn't a gesture of romance, it was something deeper, a shared grief, a silent promise of an alliance. He won't win, Clara said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised even herself. We won't let him. Silas looked at their joined hands and then back at her face, illuminated by the firelight. For the first time, he wasn't seeing a ghost or a replacement for his dead wife. He was seeing Clara, a woman with a quiet strength that rivaled the mountains, with a spirit that refused to be broken, even when the world had tried its best to break her. The next morning, the sheriff showed up at their door. A tall, weaselly man named Biddle, who everyone knew was squarely in Mr. Finch's pocket. "McGrath," he said, not quite meeting Silas's eyes. "Got a complaint. A moral complaint, you might say, about your living arrangements." "There's nothing immoral happening here, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice flat and even. Clara stood behind him, Ellie rose, clinging to her skirts. "That's not for me to say," Biddle said, shifting his weight. "But Mr. Finch, as the head of the town council, has requested that Miss Dawson here be removed. For her own protection, of course. We can't have a lone woman's reputation being sullied. It was a trap. A perfectly legal, socially acceptable trap. If Silas refused, he'd be defying the town council. If he agreed, he'd be throwing Clara to the wolves. Finch was trying to isolate her, to get her away from Silas's protection." "She's not leaving," Silas said. The sheriff sighed. "Don't make this difficult, Silas. Finch also mentioned the note on your property. It's due at the end of the month. He's not inclined to grant an extension, especially not if you're harboring a woman of ill repute." The threat was laid bare. Give up, Clara, or lose everything. Clara felt a wave of nausea. This was her fault. Her presence was going to cost this man his home, his land, the only legacy he had for his daughter. She was about to speak, to say she would go, when Silas did something completely unexpected. He turned to her, his expression serious. "Clara May Dawson," he said, his voice clear and strong, loud enough for the sheriff to hear every word. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. The sheriff's jaw dropped. Ellie rose, sensing the shift in the air, looked up at them with wide, curious eyes. It wasn't a proposal born of love or passion. It was a strategic move, a declaration of war. A married woman was not a lone woman. A wife was not of ill repute. By marrying her, Silas was shielding her with his name, drawing a line in the sand that not even Finch could easily cross. But it was also a cage. It would bind her to him, to this fight, to this town. It was a life she hadn't chosen. Her heart pounded in her chest. She looked from Silas's determined face to the sheriff's stunned expression, and then down at the little girl holding her hand. Ellie Rose looked up at her and whispered, "Say yes, Mama." And in that moment, Clara knew what she had to do. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, for Sarah, for Silas, for herself. She looked straight at the sheriff and then at Silas and said, "Yes, I will marry you." The wedding was a strange, hurried affair. The town preacher, a nervous man who also owed money to Finch's bank, performed the ceremony right there on the porch of the cabin. There were no flowers, no white dress, no celebration. The only witnesses were a bewildered Ellie Rose and a hostile Sheriff Biddle. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss, just a grim, determined nod between Silas and Clara. They had forged a partnership, a fortress against the storm that was coming. Finch was furious. His plan had backfired spectacularly. He couldn't have Clara run out of town now. She was Mrs. McGrath, a respectable married woman. But his rage only made him more dangerous. He couldn't attack her reputation, so he would attack their livelihood. The very next day, a notice was posted on the door of their cabin. The bank was foreclosing. They had 1 week to pay the full amount of the loan, or they would be evicted. The amount was impossible. It was more money than Silas could make in 5 years. Despair settled over the small cabin like a thick fog. Silas spent his days staring out at the land that had been in his family for generations, his face a mask of stone. Clara tried to keep their spirits up for Ellie Rose's sake, but at night she would lie awake on her cot, listening to Silas's restless turning in the other room, and the weight of their situation would crush her. She went back to Sarah's diary, reading the pages over and over, searching for something, anything, that could help them. And then she found it, a small, overlooked entry from the last week of Sarah's life. Finch was here again, ranting about the land. He said he knows its secret, that my father was a fool to sell it to Silas's family for so cheap. He kept mentioning the old Silver Creek, the one that dried up years ago. He said there's more than just water buried there. He said there's a fortune under our feet, and he will have it, one way or another. A fortune. Clara's mind raced. The old Silver Creek ran through the back corner of Silas's property, a place everyone ignored because it was rocky and barren. Could it be true? Was Finch's obsession with the land not just about revenge, but about greed? She showed the entry to Silas. He was skeptical at first. It sounded like a desperate fantasy. But as he thought about it, he remembered the old stories his grandfather used to tell about miners finding silver veins in the hills north of their property. No one had ever thought to look on their land. They had nothing to lose. With a new, frantic energy, they took a pickaxe and shovels and went to the dry creek bed. They dug for hours, the sun beating down on them, their hands blistering and raw. Just as they were about to give up, Silas's shovel hit something hard, not a rock. It was a metallic clink. He dropped to his knees and cleared away the dirt. It was a thick, dark vein of rock, shot through with shimmering threads of pure, unmistakable silver. It wasn't just a small deposit. The vein was wide and deep, running as far as they could see. It was the fortune Sarah had written about. It was enough to pay off the bank 10 times over. They had won. Or so they thought. As they stood there staring at their salvation, a shadow fell over them. Mr. Finch stood on the ridge above the creek, a cruel smile spreading across his face, and he wasn't alone. Sheriff Biddle and 2 hired men stood with him, all of them holding rifles. "Well, well," Finch said, his voice dripping with false admiration. "Looks like you found it. I have to thank your late wife for the tip. She was quite talkative in the end." The words were a poisoned dart, aimed right at Silas's heart. "Unfortunately for you, this discovery was made on bank property. And since you've defaulted on your loan, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Now." It was the ultimate betrayal. He had let them do the hard work, waiting for them to uncover the prize he knew was there all along. He had used Sarah's secret, a secret she had likely shared in a moment of fear and desperation, against her husband. Silas saw red. He let out a roar of pure rage and started up the hill toward Finch, but one of the hired guns fired a warning shot into the dirt at his feet, stopping him cold. "Don't be a fool, McGrath," Finch sneered. "It's over. The land is mine, the silver is mine, and now your wife will be mine too." He leered at Clara, his eyes filled with a possessive ugliness. "A widow needs a man to take care of her after all, and I am a very forgiving man." Clara felt a terror so profound it almost paralyzed her. This man wouldn't just take their home, he would take everything. He would destroy them completely, just as he had destroyed Sarah. She looked at Silas, at his face, contorted with helpless fury. She looked at the guns pointed at them, and she knew there was only one card left to play. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. "You're wrong," Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. "It's not over." Finch laughed. "And what are you going to do, little girl? Throw rocks at us?" "No," Clara said, taking a step forward. She looked Finch directly in the eye. "I'm going to tell them the truth, the whole truth. About how you harassed Sarah, about how you drove her to her death, about how you forged the dates on that loan default notice, about the letter you sent me." Finch's smile faltered. "What letter? You're delirious." "The mail order bride letter," Clara said, her voice getting stronger. "The one that brought me here. I thought it was from some lonely farmer, but the handwriting, it's the same as the handwriting on the foreclosure notice. It's your handwriting, isn't it, Mr. Finch? You brought me here, a woman who looks so much like Sarah. You brought me here as a pawn to torture Silas, to drive him to ruin so you could get your hands on this land." The sheriff and the hired men shifted uncomfortably. They had signed on for a simple foreclosure, not this. The accusation hung in the air, monstrous and undeniable. Finch's face had gone pale. She had guessed right. It was a wild, desperate shot in the dark, but it had hit its mark. He had orchestrated everything, every last piece of their pain. "She's lying," Finch sputtered, but the panic in his eyes betrayed him. "Am I?" Clara pressed, her courage surging. "Let's go into town right now. Let's show the letter and the notice to the judge. Let's compare the handwriting. Let's see who he believes." It was a bluff. There was no judge who would dare cross Mr. Finch. But Biddle and the other men didn't know that. All they saw was a rich man's scheme unraveling, and they were standing on the wrong side of it. Sheriff Biddle lowered his rifle. "I ain't part of this, Finch," he said, taking a step back. "This is between you and them." The other two men murmured their agreement and lowered their weapons as well. Finch was alone. His power, built on fear and intimidation, had evaporated in an instant. He looked from the mutinous faces of his hired help to the unyielding stares of Silas and Clara. He was trapped, defeated. With a strangled cry of rage, he turned and scrambled away, disappearing over the ridge. Silence fell over the dry creek bed. It was over, really over. Silas looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a dawning wonder. She hadn't just saved their home, she had saved him. She had faced down the monster he could never defeat, and had won. Not with a gun, but with courage and truth. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He cupped her face in his rough hands, his thumbs gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. And then he kissed her. It wasn't like the first kiss. This one was not born of grief or strategy. It was fierce and deep, and filled with all the unspoken words that had passed between them in the dark, quiet moments in the cabin. It was a kiss of gratitude, of respect, and of a love that had grown, strong and stubborn, in the harshest of winters. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of Ellie Rose calling for them from the cabin. Their daughter, their home, their future. The prairie stretched out before them, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The silver in the creek bed gleamed, a promise of a new beginning, a future they had earned together. They were no longer two broken people, clinging to each other for survival. They were a family, forged in fire and truth, unbreakable. What happened to Mr. Finch, you ask? Well, the story of his deception spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. His house of cards, built on debt and fear, came tumbling down. He left town in the middle of the night, a disgraced and broken man, never to be seen again. And as for Silas, Clara, and little Ellie Rose, their lives had just begun. The silver from the creek gave them security, but it was the love they had for each other that made them truly rich. They proved that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in the ground, but in the courage of a loving heart. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, hit that subscribe button, because there are always more secrets buried just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered.